But it's now my pleasure to welcome Lennart Ephraim to the stage. So the industry's come a long way since livestock had to wade ashore from barges, and that was done here in Fremantle many years ago, with purpose-built ships using high-tech equipment to deliver healthy livestock to their destinations. Lennart is responsible for strategic decision-making on where his fleet is positioned and engaging with authorities around the globe to strengthen animal welfare outcomes with his business. Would you please welcome Lennart Ephraim? Do you want a video?
I can play this way. Yes. So, good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be speaking about shipping today. It's a hot topic I've heard over the last 2 days, and especially the lack of shipping, which as a commercial person in our business is a good thing and a bad thing at the same time, I think. If people ask me, what do you do for a living? I always used to say, well, I'm in shipping. Then the next question is, well, what type of shipping do you do? Then I would say, well, I'm in livestock shipping. And then you would normally get some curious questions, some angry questions, some disturbance, and it was never a great story. So I've changed that narrative and said, when people say, what do you do for a living? I say, I feed the world. When I was a few years younger, this worked very well in the bars as well. It's a good starting sentence, but ultimately that's what we do. And if we look at world population, the next 20 years, we're probably going to have about 1 billion extra people in the world. And a lot of that growth is going to be in Asia, Africa, and that's a food security problem. And I think everyone in this room in some form of shape is going to play a role in that, and does play a role in that. And we are just, as a company, a small portion of this supply chain on the shipping side, but I'm happy to share something what keeps us busy every day. Shortly, an introduction of our company. I will speak a bit about shipping capacity, which is a hot potato, what I experienced the last 2 days, as well as a bit on ship technology development, as well as regulatory framework. So Livestock Express is operating since February 1964, so we've been around. Luckily not me as a person that long. I still have my hair, but if you look at what we do as a company, we are an independent provider of shipping capacity. So we are not involved in trading cattle, buying, selling cattle. We are purely a provider of vessels, and we service around the world whoever needs a vessel and fits whatever we need to do, where the demand goes and where the cycles of cattle flow go. So that is a unique position. We are the biggest provider in terms of capacity to the Australian market, and I'll explain a bit more about that later as to why we are so focused on Australia. To give you a bit of an overview of where we are today, we are operating 13 vessels around the globe. A majority of that is in Australia. This year so far we are, well, it's a very precise number, 624 and 122 head of cattle shipped on our tonnage up to the end of October, close to 200 voyages. And we do that with a team based in Singapore and the Netherlands. I hope this is readable. So what you see on this slide is if we look at shipping capacity, the world map here shows the actual position of all actively trading livestock ships as of, I believe I prepared this last Friday. So this is the actual position then. So what we see there is quite interesting. If you look at the different routes which livestock ships take around the world, there's about 120 ships at the moment actively trading. And what you can see from the map, there's a few clusters. South America to Middle East, Turkey, Egypt, and lately a lot to Northern Africa is an area with a lot of demand at the moment. We see about 66% of the capacity of ships is trading on that area. And those are predominantly larger vessels, simply for economies of scale obviously play a role there. The routes are much longer. From Brazil to Turkey, you're talking about a sort of 20-day voyage. in comparison to the cluster in Australia, where we ship Darwin, Jakarta 4.5 days, to Vietnam maybe 10 days. So there's a different dynamic there in terms of economies of scale. What are the main routes that ships take? So if you look at it worldwide, we've got Brazil is probably the biggest exporter in the world at the moment. I think up to July, Brazil was exporting close to 650,000 head. And the expectation was for this year to ship up to 1.5 million head out of Brazil alone. And in addition to that, we see quite a lot of activity from Uruguay, Montevideo. We are quite active there as well as Colombia to the Middle East. So destinations from there is typically, traditionally was Turkey, Egypt, but what we see now is Northern Africa is growing drastically. Very, very strong demand for a few reasons. One is consumer preference is changing there. This is typically a market where people consume mutton, sheep meat, and that is slowly changing there. There's a lot of strong preference for beef. And this used to come from Europe a lot of trucking and shipments out of Spain, and that is changing now because of disease problems in Europe, as well as much stricter regulation around trucking cattle. So before, those would be cattle on trucks and they would go on a ferry to Morocco, and that is now coming more and more out of Brazil. Other markets that you see is from Colombia, Brazil, Uruguay into the Persian Gulf. Those are very long shipments, typically with very large vessels. And then you have the very old vessels, is what I would say. You are talking about ships 50 years plus. They mostly end up into the Red Sea, where there's a big activity with sheep from Somalia, Sudan into Saudi Arabia. That's not a market we are actively in, but we're obviously monitoring what's happening. If you look now in Australia, that's where we're predominantly active, mostly into obviously Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, China, which is a bit softer at the moment. Sea distances are a lot shorter, so typically you see slightly smaller ships servicing those markets. Now, what I've put on the left side, and this is a concern it was discussed in the panel earlier, is the age of livestock ships. If you Google on livestock carriers, it's typically not a very positive story. You hear about ships having a bad reputation, breakdowns, sinking, all stability issues. As soon as you Google it, it's not a very great story, to be honest. And this is something, for us, we say, well, we are a premium shipping company. We're operating in a different arena, but obviously this affects us as well as a reputation, and I think it affects the industry in its wider perspective. And why do we, well, if you look simply at age, if you look at the ships deployed in Australia, you're looking at 19.7 years as average age, which there's a number of older ladies which may phase out. So actually there is a relatively young fleet to a certain degree. The last ship I think built was 2018, but those ships have still a long way to go. But if you look outside of that, of those 120 ships roughly, the ships that are trading outside of Australia, if you exclude the Australian approved fleet, we're talking on an average age of 42 years. Well, by all means, in the maritime industry, in container shipping, bulk shipping, car carrier shipping, that's a very old age. If you look at percentage, 55% above 40 years. So what you see there is well, it tells a story. The story one is that it's explained by regulatory framework. Ships that are trading Australia are basically half the age. Why? Because there is a much stricter regulatory framework. Outside of Australia, it is a mixed bag, I would say. So Australia's got the highest standards, and that's why only approximately 20 out of those 120 ships trading today can call Australia. Those other ships will never be allowed to load in how they look. So that is something, if you look around the world, the only places with strict regulation is Australia, and Ireland has its very specific regulation, very similar to Australia. And then you have Europe, it's got regulation, which is not a bad regulation, but our experience has been rather frustrating in Europe, where you have the European Union regulation for livestock ships, which theoretically is not bad, but every country has the ability to implement it as they deem fit. So what do you see in practicality? You've got certain countries like Portugal, who's been very proactive and almost stricter as the Australian regulation, only allowing very limited numbers of ships to load there, very strict regulation, inspections, because they interpret European regulation in a more strict manner. But if you then look at places like Romania, Spain, they decide not to implement those regulations on a very strict manner, and the enforcement abilities in Europe are simply very limited. So that's how you get a split in the fleet. So if you look at Livestock Express, we operate in Australia. Why is that? It's simply because we have ships that have complied to the Australian regulation, which means a lot higher expenses. We cannot, in principle, if everything's being equal, our ships cannot compete in South American markets, European markets, Red Sea markets, simply because costs are higher. We build up to a higher spec. We are talking about extra redundancy. If things break down, we have backup systems. You talk about stability regulation. You talk about water capacity, all sorts of regulation, inspections in Australia on the thickness of steel, all those sort of things. As it means we have higher expenses, so normally we cannot compete. What we've seen now in the last 2 years, suddenly the Brazilian market has been very, very strong, and we can actually make a reasonable return there. So we have also decided to move a few ships into those markets as we go where the trades go. But my personal opinion and the company opinion is that we should continue to push for stricter regulation around the world, because any incident happening on a livestock ship, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Europe, it has an impact here on the public opinion. So anything happening in Europe to a ship will affect us ultimately in Australia. And we've seen that happening before. So we, as a company, are talking to authorities, try to push them, not always very successful. These things take time. And then there is also a reality we have to face is that if Australian regulations were to be implemented around the globe, we suddenly have 20 ships to move all livestock around the world by ship. So there needs to be a long-term plan, but we firmly believe that this is the direction the world is going. I believe there will be stricter regulation. You see that in Europe. Population are getting more worried about these things. Countries like Spain, the Western strong economies and population simply don't accept anymore that these things are done on ships that are 50 up to 60 years old. So that's what we are also pushing for, and we hope we're going to have some success in that. And I believe it also will create a more playing, an even playing field, let's put it like that. Because what we now see, why are ships exiting the Australian market? I mean, we ourselves have sold to all the ladies this year. Ladies we refer to as vessels, for people that don't know that. But the reason is those vessels were coming up to their regular dry dockings, which means a planned maintenance period. We would almost have to spend double the amount of money to keep those vessels active in Australia up to the required standards. That's a very hard thing to justify with an uncertain revenue forward book, which was also discussed this morning. Whereas traders in South America, Red Sea, they say, well, we can buy the ship, we spend half the money on the plant maintenance, and we have a profitable asset here. So that's a challenge we face. Something about a question I often get is, well, how is your performance in terms of welfare in South America on less regulated markets? Now, if you look at the regulatory framework, why is Australia the highest standard? I think it's a combination of things. It's not one thing. Ships are very strictly regulated in Australia under what we call the Marine Order 43, which is the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, does inspections basically every time a ship calls Australia. So that is one part. They regulate the ships and they are very strict. You make a mistake, something doesn't work, ship's not allowed to load, you know what you can expect. We have to make sure our ships comply, and that's one part of the story. But if you look at I believe there's sort of 4 pillars, if you will, of how do you make a successful shipment. Because in my view, a good ship can have a bad voyage, and an average ship can have a good voyage, as long as at least 3 of those pillars are in place. So one is the ship, but equally important, and I think Australia is quite unique in this, is that under the ASOL regulation, under the Department of Agriculture, there is a very strict protocol, expectation, and control of what animals actually go on the ship. And this is, I think, the big difference with other jurisdictions, where there's not so much control of what goes to the ship. So you can have a great ship, but if you get cattle that's not suitable, not well prepared, not adjusted to the feed, we've had situations where vaccinations have been given too late, so the cattle goes on the ship and they don't settle in well. It doesn't matter how good your ship is, you're going to have a bad outcome. And I think that is something we hope in the future will improve. Because the combination of having ship control as well as control throughout the supply chain in terms of cattle is critical. And that's where we've seen, we see problems. In Europe, we see countries that have a very strong agricultural department, so there's good control there. But then you would have a veterinarian with no knowledge of ships that would do the ship inspection. So what do they look at? I'm not a very technical person, so I go to a ship, and if it's nicely painted, I think this is a great ship. So that's what we face there. People come up with a ship that's actually structurally not great, but it looks nice, so a veterinarian obviously cannot have a great opinion on that. So that is what we see in Europe. Vice versa, we also see areas where the department is very, very weak in its enforcement. So you have shippers that suddenly send cattle to a boat of completely different specs, more numbers, more feed, and then you've got stability issues. I think, you know, you've seen that in Europe, ships capsizing, stability, rocking, those sort of things, and that's where all these 4 pillars matter. And very important to mention here is the crew and the stock persons. Management on board is a very, very critical element of what we do. So I think that is something we try to, well, not enforce, but we try to talk to authorities to say, how is it done in Australia? And that's where we put a lot of energy in, and we hope it will be fruitful. But I believe personally that is a matter of many years. This takes 5-10 years before things will be implemented. Now, one thing to also talk about as a little bit different apart from shipping capacity is communication technology on ships and where we stand today. If you look at what I see is the catalyst or the most important thing of what's going to enable improvements in the upcoming years is its communication. I've made an overview of the costs and the abilities for us as a shipping company in terms of communication on vessels. So if you look around 2010, 50 megabytes per month per vessel. That's how we were operating. And then you have a backup satellite phone, very expensive per vessel, 50 megabytes, $3,000. So communication was very, very basic. Now I joined the operations department of our company in 2013, and at that time communication still very, very limited. A lot of times you talk to a captain, the line would break up, you would have to fall back to emails. Proper communication was a challenge. And we've seen that change very drastically, obviously ashore earlier, but on the ships we start to see that now. Good example, last week we had a cyclone going over Darwin, and one of our ships was approaching, planned to load. So there was obviously discussion on what is possible. Do we load before? Do we load after? What is good for the cattle? Suddenly say, let's have a call. And we have the port, the stewardess, the exporter, and the ship captain all on video call in the same call, and in half an hour you all align. And I think that's, that's great to see, and then that's something that's been possible simply because of communication. So all our ships are now equipped with Starlink, so you almost have the same communication as at home, which helps us in many, many ways. Give you a bit of insight what that allows us to do. So I mentioned already we're doing all these video calls, we have connection, but we've also built mesh networks in the ship. So what we've done over recent years is you start seeing sensor data becoming much more relevant. So we have a lot of data we're collecting. So today we can log in anytime, see on every deck, every compartment, what are temperatures, what is happening, what is humidity, all those sort of things. And I believe this is something that's only going to grow. But what is the next step is to bring all this data into information. So we've seen the whole AI development ashore. I firmly believe this is going to get into the maritime environment. If you look at the Darwin, Indonesia voyages, weight gains, all those things are very relevant, but it's very hard to pinpoint what is now causing weight gains, when do you have it, when you not have it. It's a combination of the ship, the feed, but big data becomes relevant. You can start combining these things and potentially even start predicting things. So I would encourage people in the room here. I think it's still a field that we need to explore. And I think within the supply chain on the producer side, probably also road transport, I think there is a conversation there of what is everyone in this supply chain doing in terms of technology, measuring things, and how can we bring that together. This is another example of what we do today in terms of improving ultimately welfare, but mostly reliability of vessels. Is in a similar way, we use a lot of sensor data where we live can log into the ship, see all the engine parameters. Our engine makers can log into this. What does this? We turn into a regime which is more predictive maintenance rather than planned maintenance or unplanned maintenance, which is the worst. Something breaks down and you got to fix it. So we can start seeing, well, there's a temperature deviation on the engine, let's address it. So I think this is an area in terms of technology which improves reliability on the ships. I would like to say, final thing is I've heard a lot of concerns about shipping capacity. We as a company have been operating since the 80s very actively in Australia, and we are committed to service this industry. We're very excited about it. We believe Australia has the best standards. We believe in the best standards, and we look forward to continuing that journey. We've been on that journey for 61 years, and we firmly believe we will be there for the next 60 years. And we look forward to working together with everyone in the supply chain in this regards. Thank you.